You talked about his leadership, and I want to just maybe focus on that a little bit because I want to draw it to what we see perhaps today. One, his principled approach to leadership, followed his principles at all in all situations. His consistency in applying those principles, and then his understanding of how to meet people where they're at. Right. So understanding that with change, you don't just move change at all costs. You got to bring people along if you believe in a unified environment. Those three things, sometimes I feel, at least on the surface level, we don't know what's going through every world leader's minds, right? Maybe they're all trying to aspire to do the similar things. We don't know. But on the surface, it seems like some of those characteristics of leadership are missing today. Do you feel that in any way from what you see with world leaders today?
Yeah, I think it's lacking. And we do not have a leader in the world like Nelson Mandela. And I'll tell you a little bit more about him. And
Mm-hmm.
that might serve as an example of why I say we do not have leaders like him. You know, this time of year, I spend a lot of time outside here in my backyard in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I didn't know about Nelson Mandela, and I only learned this when I read his book, Long Walk to Freedom. Now, I've got a treasured copy of Long Walk to Freedom. He signed it for me, but I never read it. I always used to joke. I said, I know the story. But
Mm-hmm.
I started reading Long Walk to Freedom when I boarded the plane in 2013 to go to his funeral. In that book, I learned that Nelson Mandela was an avid gardener. And he gardened on Robben Island. And he says, in many ways, I saw my garden as a metaphor for many aspects of my life. And he says, a gardener, like a leader, plants seeds, and then he watches and he cultivates and he harvests the responsibility. And I don't think we see too much of that in leaders today. Mandela also told a story in his book about when he was a kid. They used to ride around on donkeys, and a donkey threw him off into a thorn bush. And he says, I learned at a very young age that to humiliate somebody is to make them suffer an unnecessarily cruel fate. He says it's possible to defeat your opponent without dishonoring them.
Mm-hmm.
And if we see how political opponents, go at each other and how they treat each other and what they say of each other, I think it reflects more on them than what it does on their opponents.
Yeah.
Mandela didn't do that. I mentioned earlier, he took time, to get to know South Africans. And that's important because it ensures you don't get separated from the people you represent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was the proposition that his way of doing things stands for is that if you really get to know people, it's really hard to treat them poorly.
Mm-hmm.
And Mandela didn't suddenly become this way. He's always like that in his life. Like one of the former presidents after Mandela said, what made him so great was precisely what made him human. Again, I think better people make better leaders. Mandela knew that involving people in something productive is a one way of ensuring that they don't become negative.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't always work, but he tried.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think he also involved people like me and kept me informed. I spoke to him a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you do those two things, you involve people and you keep them informed, chances are they're going to make a big impact. And sometimes I think